Okay, welcome back for the second day of our season opener there, and hopefully everyone had a good time last night, got well rested, and we're ready to go for today. And thanks very much for everyone for wearing their orange shirts today. That's really appreciated the support. Okay, Hockey Manitoba acknowledges that we operate on the traditional ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, Dene, and Inuit people, and the homeland of the Red River Métis Nation. We respectfully acknowledge treaties 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, along with our role in the many relationships that make up our home, and commit to a spirit of reconciliation. I'd like to welcome everyone back. As I said earlier today, today we have a very important presentation by Dr. Leslie-Toogood. This is a very topical for us, certainly on how you go about changing the culture or cultivating a culture that to elevate performance with our athletes. Over the last few years, hockey has undergone some significant changes, and culture is very topical for us. I know she brings a lot of experience to her. With you've had the opportunity to read her bio there that we've placed in the season opener. It's been involved with high-level athletes, not only with hockey, but a number of different sports. And I know that she has a lot of very useful information, very energetic, very passionate, and I'm really looking forward to it. So if you could just please welcome Dr. Leslie-Toogood.
Thank you so much for including us in your conference. It looks like an excellent agenda, and we look forward to chatting about it. It's the morning. I appreciate you showing up so early, which is great, especially with, a topic that can sometimes not be super fun and, great to talk about. But we're going to try and make it fun. It's not just going to be me today. I brought a couple members of my team. We have Lindsay Berard. Lindsay Berard is someone I've worked with for many, many years, and one of the projects she's involved with is a Culture of Excellence project that's funded through Own the Podium. There's been a lot of news around hockey and a lot of news about high-performance sport in our country. So Own the Podium recognized a need to work with national sport organizations to help their culture and to create cultures where we not only work on performance, but we also work on the human beings that are doing the sport, including the players and the staff. And we have Justine Fredette. Justine Fredette's also someone I've worked with for a number of years, and Justine definitely has a hockey background, was a captain at the University of Connecticut. Her fiance was a captain of the Winkler Flyers and also captain of his Division I hockey program down that he played in the United States. So she's pretty immersed in the hockey culture. I'm going to set the stage a little bit. Lindsay's going to talk a little bit about some of the culture change models, and then Justine's going to get really hands-on and practical. And, it's fun to talk about this stuff at a very high level, but how do you actually do it? You're all culture champions in your community. In hockey, it is a very closed community, and if culture is going to change, it will be the fact that all of you will be the ones who change it. So we look forward to having this conversation. To start off with, we are going to do some Mentimeter with you. Maybe. My clicker's not working currently, so we'll see if we're going to do some Mentimeter. What we'd like to do is the opposite of what people say at a lot of presentations. We'd actually like you to get your phone out. And we'd like you to go menti.com, MENTI.com. Some of you may have done Mentimeter, some may not, so it's a new experience. And you'll see that you enter a code. And so we'd like you to enter that number, 339-1166. And then we'll answer some questions. And I think we'll switch a screen so that we can see what the responses are. Your answers will be anonymous, so we can't tell who says what. Yeah, it's 339-1166. All right. Great, fun, challenging, fun, fast, skilled, fun for kids, competition, energy, excitement, life. Male dominate selfish. That's a little different than the other ones. Leadership. Then we'll scroll up and see what some of the other ones are. Okay, so awesome to see people's perspectives on hockey. Fast, competitive team, active, fun competition. Love it. Quick teamwork, friendship. Very nice. All right, we'll go to the next question. When you see recent headlines coming out about hockey, do the words you chose align? Somewhat? No? Okay. Some variability in terms of people's thoughts around that. Next question. Yeah. Now we're going to read a scenario, and Justine has younger eyes than I do, so she can actually read this.
Okay, so the situation is you have a 12-year-old on a double A team, and this 12-year-old has drill busted for the third time in a row. I'm assuming whatever knows what drill busted is. They didn't complete the drill for the third time properly. And in this situation, the coach pauses the drill, yells at the kid in front of the entire team, telling them that they messed up and stuff like that. So there you go.
Okay, is the way the coach responded okay in this situation? Depends on the circumstance, sometimes never. So with this, what we're trying to illustrate is that culture is very contextual, and there's a lot of information we need to know. And a lot of times when sound bites happen in the media and social media, we don't get the entire context. Were you gonna say something? No? Okay. Okay, excellent. Next. Have you done this? The moment of truth. That's the last one, eh? Okay. And there's a last question. Last question. What makes change hard? Lots of great answers. Appreciate your honesty. There we go. Excellent. I agree with almost everything I'm seeing up there. It's awesome. Excellent. As those come up, you can continue to look at them, and then we'll switch back to the PowerPoint presentation. But those are excellent answers. I really appreciate your honesty. As Peter mentioned, I've had the privilege to sit in a lot of rooms and be involved in a lot of sports, and I've also worked with athletes a lot through the SDRCC process, which is a Sport Dispute Resolution Council of Canada. And I can honestly say that in this work, I have yet to run into bad people. I've run into a lot of people that have passion and care, and I've never run into someone who's intentionally trying to damage or harm someone. I know that those people do exist, but for the most part, I really don't think that there's a lot. When the Olympic Games were canceled because of COVID, Chris Hadfield came and talked to the Olympic athletes and coaches, and it was a really powerful Zoom call. It was our first introduction to Zoom. But he came on and he looked at us and he said, the world is different now. And the sooner you accept that reality, the better off you'll be. And he went on to talk about his lived experience of being an astronaut. And if you go up into space and you don't accept that the conditions are different, then you're going to run into a lot of trouble. And so with this culture conversation, I think that the world is different. It's not just hockey, it's not just sport. We work in a lot of corporate settings as well. People are talking more about mental health. They're talking more about things they never talked about before, and they're not going to stop talking about them. And how do we make conditions, and how do we still push people, and how do we create environments where people can thrive? So one of the environments that I have worked in was the Winnipeg Ice. I worked at Hockey Canada, and Matt Cockle was the GM for the Winnipeg Ice. So prior to the team moving here, he reached out to me. And he was like, hey, I'd love if you could work with us. My first answer was that, well, I'll need to go and spend time with your head coach. I will never work with a program unless Whoa, did I do that? Poor Coach Patrick. Um, unless I talk to the coach. The coach is the one who has, that's his team. So Coach Patrick and I spend a lot of time together. And for anyone who knows Coach Patrick, he's a talker, likes to chat. So when I told him I was doing this presentation, I said, "Hey, Coach, I'm going to do this presentation. Do you have any thoughts?" And this is kind of what he said, amongst other things. But he just said, "I felt we had a successful process that we built with the Winnipeg Ice, what we accomplished on the ice, and none of it would have been possible if we didn't first address the culture. The attitude, expectation, and behavior model were all necessary off-ice ingredients. I did not know this before. I now know that there is a formula. There really is a formula for doing things right. And we spent a lot of time on culture with the athletes. And interestingly, we could have had a Wenatchee Wild little headline up there because unfortunately they had an incident and their coach is currently being suspended. And again, in my experience, a lot of times it's because we don't have conversations early enough and we don't create space for people to voice their concerns, and then we end up in situations where unfortunately it goes above. Another program I've had the pleasure of being involved with is the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. I've been very immersed for the last 4 years, and Coach O'Shea is one of the guests that was on our podcast, and I definitely consider him a very close friend. And he's someone who, if you talk to Wade Miller, if you talk to Mike O'Shea, and you asked why we've won back-to-back championships, they would talk about culture. They'd talk about the work that we've put into creating that environment. And as everyone knows, we also just, we lost a Grey Cup by 1 point. And culture is about Coach O'Shea showing up. We lose by 1 point. People aren't in good spirits, and he walks into the dressing room. He looks around, and he says that, I want every one of you to look at the guy beside you, and I want you to know that that guy did the very best he could today. Made all those guys embrace each other, and, that's his culture. He's also a guy who last night at halftime was not a happy human and had a conversation with his team. So culture isn't all like, rainbows and unicorns. It's about having trusting relationships with your humans, knowing what they need, and having honest conversations so you give them the privilege of being the very best version of themselves. It's something that he continuously works on. And honestly, both of those coaches, right, they coach their way, they do it their way, they understand what their values are, and they make decisions that are aligned with that. So with the current state of hockey, obviously there's lots of headlines that we can grab, and these aren't even the most recent ones. Even, the WHL this morning, when I was having my breakfast, my husband knows my areas of passion, so he always tells me what's going on, and he was letting me know that there's a captain in the WHL that was named and had some, racial incidents in the past, and it's pretty controversial right now. So there's always conversation and things happening. I had a graduate student once named Donna Harris, and she did her master's thesis. And with her master's thesis, she was looking at an area of passion, obsessive versus harmonious passion, with someone named Valorant. And she interviewed a bunch of coaches, all national team, all Olympic coaches. And this was one of the quotes that came from her research. When you're that one person, maybe there's more often you're the one person that they really trust and put their sport performance in your hands. I don't take that lightly. I have, children who've been very involved in sports, been a huge part of their life, and I have a son who's involved in hockey. And I see the care and the passion hockey coaches have. I see the weight they carry because of the pathway and how much they want these kids to have every opportunity possible. So, that's definitely something that I think is important and incredibly important to consider. On the right is last week I was actually in London at the Safe Sport International Conference, and if you fly overseas, sometimes you're just trying to stay awake at night. So I was walking around and trying to stay awake, and I looked, and I'm like, oh, what's this ABBA thing? So I go and talk to them. I'm like, is there an ABBA concert tonight? And there's this virtual, I'm like, okay, cool. So I went to this ABBA thing, and let me tell you, that was fun. People were wearing their outfits, and they're dancing and singing. And it just struck me that, I think we're having the wrong conversations where what's okay to do, what's not okay to do, where's the threshold? And, that's not why people get involved in sport. That's not why you coach. That's not why people love it. People are involved in sport because they want to be, they want to have this incredible experience. They want a place where they belong. They want a sense of community. That's why people do sports. So I think that's where we want to really have this conversation from today. There's lots of barriers. This is some research that's been done that looks at, gosh, what's going wrong here? Why aren't we doing as well as we'd like in sport? And sometimes it's that you grow up in sport. I grew up in sport. Sport raised me. And, sometimes we don't recognize, it's just different. Again, it's a closed system. So we don't recognize that the world's changing and evolving, just like Chris Hadfield told us. Sometimes we don't understand that, we want to perform so badly. But what's really awesome about some of the environments I've been in is that I've been able to learn that they're not mutually exclusive. Firm believer at this point that if someone is, you have to be physically well, and I think we get that. We got to keep that body well to do our best. But you know what? We also have to be mentally and emotionally well, because sport is hard. We're going to get tough feedback. We're not going to get the drill right away. We're going to have a tough game. And we have to be mentally well so we can handle that and we can come back and work tomorrow. Sometimes we want to be part of things so badly that we don't speak up. We don't tell people what we notice, and how do we change that culture environment so that we have one of openness, one that's deliberately developmental, one where people can tell us that I don't feel comfortable right now. And then, we don't always have a diverse room, and we can look around this room. There's not a lot of diversity in the room, and so we just don't understand. I was telling Peter before, no, actually, I think I was telling Bernie before, but I used to work at Kansas State University, and there was a faculty member there, and his name was Dr. Atta Karim. And he came back to, he would go on these meetings, and what he was doing at the time was he's literally being flown in and paid a lot of money at these multinational corporations to sit around a table and give them feedback on their ad campaigns. At the time, Pepsi, Cola, there were several large national campaigns that cost millions of dollars that got pulled after one day that they were out there because they offended entire groups of people. He came back and said something that I started with. He said, you know what, Adrienne? There's no bad people. They just don't have the right voices around the table. They're doing their very best to make decisions, but they just don't know the context. And, I think sometimes that's where we grew up in a sport. We grew up in an environment, and we are just really, really busy, and we haven't gotten around to going in and asking about those other voices. One of the, we talked about this in Mentimeter. Actually, we had unbelievable answers up there in terms of what gets in the way of changing culture. And one of the things I had the opportunity to do during COVID, I've worked with Golf Canada for many, many years. And Lawrence Applebaum, the CEO, reached out and said, hey, Adrienne, we need to do something in the equity, diversity, and inclusion space. Can you lead a coalition or something with our organization? And I was like, oh, I'm not really sure. But, this work is trust work. And I had the trust of Golf Canada because I'd worked there for a very long time. So they trusted me in this space. But I definitely wasn't an expert. And we did a lot of professional development during that time. And one of the speakers came in and she said, I don't really like this idea of safe space or psychological safety. She's like, how can you guarantee that for someone? I don't know what's safe for someone. She goes, instead, I like this idea of creating brave space. How do we create a space where people have the courage to ask questions, say things they disagree with, bring their whole selves? And so I think as we have this conversation, I think it's really important for us to acknowledge that we're all human beings. We have biases. We have ways we like to do things. And if we really do want to change spaces and make them brave or safe, we have to acknowledge and embrace the fact that we're human. And I just think that's a really, really important part of it. As I mentioned, now Lindsay's going to jump in, and she's going to talk to us just a little bit about some of the work we've been doing at the national level with the Culture of Excellence Project, and just some of the frameworks that I know were really helpful for us to think about as we were doing this work. And then Justine's going to get it really hands-on and allow you guys to have some interaction and conversation at your tables. So I'll pass it over to Lindsay.
Thank you, Adrienne. So I was just blown away reading those answers. I think that you guys have really highlighted a lot of the things that we come up against in terms of talking with athletes, in terms of talking with coaches and other organization leaders. There's things like, there's fear, there's worry, there's not having everybody on board, there's trying to convince people, there's lack of time and funding and resources. There's so many different kind of barriers and things that really get in the way of changing culture. Another kind of line of comments was this is kind of just the way things are done. And so that's definitely something that we continue to kind of come up against in the work that we do. So Adrienne kind of mentioned this Culture of Excellence project that we're working on. And really, we've created this group of humans who are trained in either psychology or organizational culture, and armed them with the tools to go in and kind of get to know the organization, the leaders of that organization, and then have some tools to have brave conversations, as Adrienne mentioned, and really start to get a pulse of what is the organizational culture, what is happening here. We talk to the athletes, we talk to coaches, we talk to the leaders, and just try to get a sense of, this person really feels and says this, and this group of humans feels and says this, and how do we kind of put that all together and bring people together so that we can create change? So we start off with kind of getting people into the right mindset in terms of what our job is here. Our job is not to kind of change the culture, it's to create opportunities to facilitate opportunities for brave conversations, for highlighting the really difficult, hard truths and not point fingers at humans. Because no one is going to create change or want to be employed to do anything if we're finger pointing and looking for points of blame. So that is not ever our intention here. As Adrienne mentioned, kind of there is no bad people. There is no one that comes into sport with the idea of like, I'm gonna ruin that kid's life. I really want them to like drop out of their sport by the age of 14 and never wanna play again. We recognize that. So it's creating these opportunities to take a look, and we think of it as like holding up a mirror and going, okay, where can we start? How can we start to get people to have really uncomfortable conversations and walk away feeling like that was helpful and productive? So what is organizational culture? We like to think of it as like the way we do things around here. So in terms of hockey, there's culture within each of your teams. There's culture within each of your clubs, organizations. There's Hockey Manitoba more broadly. There's Hockey Canada and how we kind of fit in. And someone kind of mentioned on the Menti that, yeah, it's a Canadian thing. This is why people play hockey. They want to feel connected to that hockey culture. So within organizations and within the culture, there's things that are explicit and there's things that are implicit. So explicit is what it is that we see, what people say that they do. When we have like missions or visions or values, that's an explicit version of what the organization culture is. It's conscious intention, so it's maybe creating the space to go up and connect with another coach or support another coach as they're learning how to coach this athlete. It's the things that we kind of do outwardly that people can pick up. It's like papers, it's policies, it's that kind of thing. That is the explicit version of organizational culture. The implicit is really what's kind of beneath the surface. So it's what's hidden. It's what is taught and being shared or felt within the group, but not shared. So we might not say, everybody has to dress a certain way. Well, actually, we would say that. Never mind. I was going to say, everyone dresses a certain way when they go to a game. That is an explicit version of culture. I overheard a conversation earlier about the challenges of getting everybody to dress in the same way, which is maybe financially that family can't afford to buy the same suit. So how that kid feels with going, I can't ask my parents for a $200 suit to wear to the team so that I fit in with everybody else, that would be an example of that person's implicit version of that culture. So implicit is also the things that we don't necessarily think about. It's unconscious. And it's kind of how, the feelings or sensations or the feeling of belonging that someone might have. So we like to highlight this model. I think that it's a really great example of that implicit and explicit. So everybody is familiar with an iceberg, and you probably have seen maybe those like motivational posters about icebergs or that kind of thing. But this is a model from organizational culture called the SHINE model. And so it really highlights the fact that on the top of the surface, whatever you see above the water are those visible elements of culture. So what we say we do. The underneath, which is much bigger, much wider, much more hidden, is what we actually do. So there's a difference there. We might see and look at an organization and go, yeah, like on paper, their vision mission is right on point. That makes a lot of sense. They're really focused on creating safe spaces, brave spaces where people are all inclusive and everything's great. Underneath the iceberg is what all of those coaches feel, those hard conversations you have, how an athlete is responding, how they treat each other. So it's things like the unwritten rules and relationships. It's things like status within a team and within an organization. It's the attitudes and feelings that are said and not said between humans. And then kind of the fundamental needs that we all have. So safety, belonging, inclusion, those kinds of things. So recognizing that it's not just what we say we do, but it's a lot more, and the harder stuff is actually what's kind of underneath. So when we think about kind of how it is that we can really try to support aligning with a culture that really highlights performance, we include this idea that there is a person element and there's a performance element. So at no point are we ever saying in an organizational culture with sport, we're just going to focus 100% on the humans and what they need. We recognize that, like, for athletes to feel great about the work that they're doing, they also need to be performing their best. They want to be winning, they want to be growing, they want to be challenging themselves. So we're never ever saying get rid of the performance side. It's looking at that in line with the person. Right, so if we have on kind of this matrix, which is grounded in decades of research, and we had a committee that was brought together at On the Podium to kind of highlight some of the organizational challenges and changes, and how can we model this? How can we look for like a guiding light or a thing for us at least to focus in on that we know is not just throwing darts in the dark and seeing what we get? So they came up with this culture of excellence matrix, highlighting both this continuum of person as well as continuum of performance. So the culture of care on that lighter gray on the top left is if you only focus on the person and not at all on the performance, you'd have, a poor to mediocre performance. You'd have people that are really going to be maybe engaged and feel satisfied, but they might not feel driven. Below that, we have the culture of apathy, which would be no performance, no person. That's a culture that probably no one in this room or anybody that we work with would want to be in, right? We don't have a lot of participation. We don't have a lot of drive. No one actually feels good being there. Not a great culture at all. Moving my way kind of through to the bottom right is the culture of harassment, that darker color, which is if we only focus on performance and completely leave the human on the side, we're probably going to get some variable performance. And one of the challenges I run into with working with coaches that maybe have lived in or experienced a culture of harassment, or this is how things were done when they were coming up back in the day, is that sometimes people win. And sometimes really challenging cultures do push athletes to do their best and win medals and podium. The challenge is that it generally does not tend to be consistent performance over time, and we end up with athletes who are burnt out or who leave the sport kind of as a broken human is kind of how we sometimes describe that. Going up to the top right, in the right-hand side in the red is this culture of quality where we're highlighting the person and performance. Recognizing that kind of in that top corner where we're really, really doing a great job of the person and performance, that's where we get this culture of excellence. That's where we get this magic of people being their best, of pushing themselves, of always growing, as well as really great consistent performance where people are getting better. So that's kind of in terms of like, where is the aim that we're trying to get to? We really try to help focus on both the person and the performance. That's not just for the athletes, that's for the coaches, the staff, everybody within the organization as well. To highlight kind of this discrepancy, I'm sure some of you have kind of seen this or maybe were actually involved in this summit. This was the Hockey Canada Summit of Beyond the Boards just recently, and this activity was highlighting a research project where they gave university athletes these masks, these white masks, and asked to kind of decorate the outside of the mask of what is it that hockey looks like? What do people recognize when kind of they see or talk about or think about hockey? So words like, smart, focused, boys will be boys, power, money. That's kind of from outwardly facing what these athletes experienced and kind of had in their life. It was really interesting when they asked athletes to write on the inside how they actually felt and what their experience actually was like. So there was a lot of things like emotion, of hard situations, of being suppressed, of not being able to really voice yourself and what it is that you need to be healthy and safe and well. There was a lack of confidence, complexity, challenge, weakness, discriminative terms that were used in there. It was really this moving experience of saying how we really want to try to acknowledge the fact that the outside does not match the inside. And if we just assume that the outside is all that these athletes and humans are feeling, we're going to miss the boat. So we need to create space and opportunity to see what's happening on the inside in order for us to really be able to move things forward. we've worked with cultures and organizations where the leaders didn't want to spend time acknowledging the stuff that people were feeling. And in a recent, one of the organizations that we've had the privilege of working with, there was a really brave human that stood up and went, we can't do the outward facing stuff until you acknowledge to literally everyone in this organization all this inward stuff. And so we had to take the time. We were privileged to take the time to say, okay, what is your experience? Because when we have that highlighted, we get to move forward together. And it's a pretty amazing thing when culture really brings together these different pieces and allows for lasting change in that way. Another complexity of the culture and the work that you guys do is the fact that you have a really long season. We recognize that coaching, that organization, that coordinating humans and herding cats to go in the same direction for the same time and being all of these things kind of aligning is really hard. Recognizing it is a long season, recognizing that a lot of you have many hats and are doing this either on the side of your life or kind of in addition to a lot of other things. And as is mentioned there on the bottom, like most people have a difficult time staying well and kind of staying consistent in their life for 7 months, regardless of what the situation is. Never mind adding in a duty of coaching, adding in stressors of losses or challenges, trying to get a team to be cohesive and moving in the same direction. So we recognize that it definitely is a lot. Another human that has been on the podcast is Matt Bailey, who is a professional hockey player. Is he from Winnipeg or Manitoba? Yeah. Manitoba guy who went over and played in Europe. And he kind of, again, knowing that we were doing this talk, shared kind of some thoughts about, you know, that we do recognize that there's a lot of challenges. You guys named pretty well all of them that we come up against. But that despite that, we want to kind of consider that the longer kids are interested in the sports and the more that we can kind of continue to create humans to allow them to develop is good for everyone in hockey. I love how he added, it sounds soft, but it's not. The best thing that we can do for athletes is to create a fun environment and encourage them to be their very own best coach. So when we think about kind of, we've brought you through, you know, what has been happening. You've talked about what happens in your organizations and around the situations you're in. We've highlighted this fact that, yeah, there's a lot of places of like, what is this? Where am I going? And so we want to try to get into where do we start? Because as Adrienne kind of highlighted, the fact that all of you are culture champions. It is not one human in one specific spot, but it takes every single person to be kind of moving in the same direction, to be wanting the same things, to highlight that this is how we need to do this, and how can I partner with other people and bring them along on this journey. So in a talk that we had seen at a sports scientist conference, there was a speaker who does research in resiliency, and he is from Europe, but I really love this from our Manitoba roots here for the highlighting of culture. So the quote on the left, I think, is something that probably a lot of people have heard of. When a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows, not the flower. And he took that a step further and highlighted, you know, how do we do this culture stuff? And he equated it to thinking like a farmer. So I really loved this idea. So we don't want to shout at the crops if we're a farmer, and I don't know if anyone here is rural or a farmer as well, or comes from a farming family, but my family is farmers up by Dauphin. So my uncle does not shout at his crops. That's not super helpful in helping them grow. He doesn't blame the crops for not growing fast enough. He also doesn't just rip out all the crops because they're not growing before they've had a chance to do that. He's going to be really thoughtful about choosing the best plants for the soil, for the rotation, to make sure that there's the right nutrients. That's not just like a throwaway kind of a decision. That's something that takes a lot of thought and care. He's going to irrigate, fertilize. They're going to remove the weeds. And then recognize that there's going to be some really good seasons and there's going to be some really bad seasons. We can't necessarily control the weather that we have in our environment, that external factors, but we can start to think about how we want to be prepared for it. So thinking about that and kind of the culture, I think it's a really lovely analogy to highlight that, yeah, when we think of it like this, it seems kind of silly, recognizing that when you're in the moment, it's definitely different. So highlighting, Justine's going to kind of walk through some of these different ways that we can think about culture, both from for yourself, high performance culture, high support culture for the people in this room. We talked about kind of athletes as well as parents, because that was highlighted as a barrier for sure. So we'll talk through some of those different ways. But one of the kind of last kind of research-founded aspects of where we're wanting to kind of highlight is that it has been demonstrated that when we do have a high level of culture and we do a high level of challenge and a high level of support, we can get that high performance culture. So I know that someone highlighted the fact of like, we don't really necessarily know how to do this and if it's going to work. These research, this background, this study is letting you know that these things are really working. We've seen it, we've felt it, it's amazing. It's hard work, and Justine's going to start to unpack a little bit about it.
Okay. So starting to kind of get into some of the practical ways we can impact culture. Just a thought before we get into that. One of the things I was reflecting on before coming up and doing this talk was my own coaching experience, which is far more limited than probably the experience in this room. But I remember after college, I went and did grad school in Wisconsin. And I coached a high school hockey team because I was in this place where I'm not ready to give up hockey yet, but I feel like I still want to be in the game in some way. And I look back at again, my very limited, I had no coaching experience coming into that. I was basing my entire coaching philosophy of my playing time, other coaches, successful programs I've been to, things my coaches have taught me that I've felt impacted by. And I feel like it's just this constant trickle-down effect of this was something important from here. This was something that I really liked there. And we kind of just mosh pit it together. And in hockey, again, we talked about this really closed community, that a lot of it feels like this really recycled material of people that have impacted us in some way. And over the years, gets better and better and better. But in this community, sometimes it takes a little bit of time when some of the things that we're doing might not feel great, or we glorify on one of the things there, glorify that hard work or the grind of being in it. And especially the team I was coaching, there's a reason why we don't really hear a lot of Wisconsin high school girls hockey because it's not the best. So it does get tough. And that 7-month-long season, it's not easy when you aren't the winning team. It's not easy when you have a full-time job outside of coaching. It's not easy when there's so many other layers that come together when we think of a coach, and why it's so hard to recruit coaches, because it is another full-time job on top of what you do in terms of managing parents, managing the athletes, managing yourself through it all. So as we jump in here, kind of coming back to that question at the end there of like what impacts culture. One thing I would like everyone to do during this time is checking our egos, because I think that's a big thing that I had to look at when I was kind of learning these things for myself, and adjusting the way that I communicated with young females in the sport. So adjusting our egos, and if anything comes up and you're like, whoa, maybe this doesn't feel right, or I would never do that, because I know I've had those thoughts in my head. Just being a little bit curious and asking yourselves, well, why wouldn't I do that? Why doesn't that feel like something I could impact to the guys on my team or the girls in this program? Because again, the more that we question it, the more we can lead to change. I find for myself when I was younger, I was incredibly dismissive of things that I feel like didn't work because I didn't see it before or it wasn't modeled for me. So if you find yourself in this space today, that's okay. That's what we want, is to challenge narratives, challenge things that we maybe haven't seen before. And if even one thing catches your eye of like, okay, maybe this sounds like something that could be easily feasible with my group of guys or the girls on my team, then that's a win on our part. So when we look at the first tier of defense when we're looking at the coaching world we live in is the parents in our group. And I know every person in this room probably has a couple examples of some interesting conversations you've had with parents or interactions on your team. And not every parent on your team is going to be the golden parent for coaches, and I think we all know that. So some of these strategies may work really great, and some of them might not, because not everything is a one-size-fit-all model for every single person on the planet. But we do acknowledge that with coaches, we have these dual roles, that for young coaches, it might be that I'm not that far off from the people I'm coaching in terms of age. Maybe it's I'm coaching my son or daughter's team, and I have friends that are parents on this team. Maybe it's people from work I know, or other families that I've known before, that we do have that dual relationship, and it might get in the way of how I coach or how I converse with these people. So the first thing we like to talk about when we're talking about that parent culture on your team is managing those boundaries. This is way easier said than done, to create boundaries for yourself and stick to them, because what we notice is the coach is usually the first person to break personal boundaries, because we have a hard time setting them in the first place or even identifying them. So at your tables, what we want you to do is kind of have a quick conversation of what are some boundaries you set with parents on your teams in terms of communication with you, with players, whether that's travel, trips, whether that's just on your regular day practices or games. And are these strategies effective? Are they ineffective? Maybe I haven't set any yet. Just to kind of get an idea of what other people at your table look like in terms of when we manage these boundaries. So we'll give you guys about 5 minutes to do that. Okay, so in our discussions, maybe we heard a lot of different things. Maybe we heard a lot of the same thing. The big thing here is creating boundaries that are appropriate for you. So what the person beside you at the table might do might not feel right for you, and so on and so forth. But again, coming back to that place of, if this didn't feel right, why was that? And kind of searching for that deeper meaning in it. Some of these boundaries might look like a certain hour time that parents can chat with you after games or after practices. Maybe it looks like in terms of on travel trips, maybe it's no contact at a certain point with you as the coach. Maybe it's when we're out kind of at restaurants, no hockey talk. Again, different things that you can think of that protects you as a coach and protects your well-being. One of the big things when we identify culture, I was talking with an organization we're working with yesterday, actually, on this topic. And the big question we asked them that kind of stumped them was, they understand that they need to change as an organization, but they didn't really have a point as to where they wanted to be. It was still really confusing for them as, okay, we know we need to change, but what does this look like for us? And what do we actually want to do with our organization? So when you think of the culture you want to create on your teams, it also starts with the parents, and by having the parents on board with this culture also impacts the places that you can't impact. So the car ride home, when the kid's looking out the window knowing they played like crap and singing that Kelly Clarkson song in the head with the rain coming down in the window. I've definitely been there. But you're not the one in the car with them. It's the parent managing that experience. And by parents knowing what you want to accomplish or the team's philosophy, they might be able to back you up in those situations or relay that message on past the arena doors. Similarly, what happens at home as well, that's a place where it's incredibly difficult for a coach to impact, that parents, again, by them being on board with the culture that you want to emulate, can also communicate that to their son or daughter if they aren't feeling well, if they feel like they didn't play great, if they felt they let you down or made a mistake or let the team down. That we've all been in situations like that growing up in this sport or any other sport, that by having a parent or someone else outside of you be able to constantly or repetitively relay that message is always helpful to a coach. And again, I know most people here, if you're coaching individual teams, might have parent meetings at this time of year in terms of kind of team philosophy, things like that, things that are going to impact their son or daughter. And this is a great point and touch point to emulate what you are trying to accomplish as a coach. Yes, we all want to win games. Yes, we all want to win this championship. That's on everyone's mind. But also, how do I want to leave these kids afterwards? One of the things I was thinking about too was, for the average person, the people we influence is largely our inner circle. So it's probably the same people over and over and over in our life that have been there for years. But coaches, you guys have this far, far reach, especially if you're coaching multiple programs or even just your hometown program, that each year you have the impact on 24 kids, if not more, depending where you're at. And this is the point that culture really sticks with them, because that's, again, what they're going to emulate when they go on to coach and so on and so forth when they describe the game. Another way that we like to hit this home with parents is, I think, again, maybe most people in this room have experience with parents coming up asking why their kid isn't playing, or why their kid got sad, or why their kid got benched, or who's playing with who, and all these little tough conversations that are interesting to navigate as a coach. But one way, by explaining what your culture is at the beginning of a season, you can always connect back to this. Maybe it's your culture is that you are a high-level program and that this is a program designed to win, and maybe that's kind of communicating back to the parents, this is what you signed up for. Or maybe it looks different and that we are rotating the bench because it's a program that we want all kids to touch the ice and have fair play and stuff like that. So by setting an initiative of what your culture is at the beginning of a season is something you can always come back to as a coach to explain reasonings for certain decisions along the way. So then we move on to the athletes, which I think when we think of culture in sport, this is largely the group that we are going to impact the most. Again, we have another quote with James Patrick, because we found as a coach, he really hit this home and placed so much importance on this with his kids. So the quote is here: "When you get all the kids on the same page of what's expected and how they are expected to interact and behave and treat others, and you tie that to the expectations of work ethic and getting better, when you tie that to the foundation, you can have success and keep getting it on the hockey side." So one of these things that we like to think about is, who is the player in the jersey? On the ice, when your parents in the stands, you really only know kids by their last name or the number or the one that's sticking out, maybe the one that's not sticking out. We see the kid in the jersey, but we want to know who's the player underneath that. Who are they as a human being, and not just points on a score sheet or a number on the roster. So when we talk about communicating with athletes, there's a couple different ways that we like to do this. When we talk about communication, one of the things that's really important is being deliberate in the process and really placing importance on these interactions with your kids. So interactions includes unique individuals all coming together with different histories, different life experiences, current goals, future goals, things that they want to do that most people on every team kind of have a different idea of life. Maybe I talked to some kids playing really high level hockey, and they're very okay with placing less emphasis in college on the hockey performance. Then I have some that are NHL or bust, that there's everything in between on all these teams, and it's being able to learn how to navigate that when you're communicating with these players and actually getting to know who they are under the jersey. So in these conversations, we're talking about a couple different things. We're looking at what you bring as a coach. We're bringing your own history. You're bringing the way that you approach your work, your own philosophy and values, and being your best. Then we also have the player's experience, or what they bring, which is their own version of their history, their family values, the way they feel about hockey and the process. We're talking about their future goals and and honestly just where they're at that day. And then lastly, in the communication experience, we're largely influenced by the relationship and the process of sharing feedback, and that's what the athlete takes away at the end of the day. One of the parts that's really difficult about communicating and changing the way that we communicate is we all have our own blind spots in how we communicate. I know I do, and everyone else in this room does, because for a lot of the reasons, we can't see it outwardly, that we can't hide our own emotions all the time. We sometimes can't hear our tone of voice. We sometimes are unaware of maybe the message underneath it or the bigger patterns of behavior we have along the way. Also, these blind spots that we have can be amplified by our athletes because of the following 3 reasons. The first is the emotional math. So oftentimes we discount our emotions while others double them. So how we leave an experience might feel incredibly different than the 16-year-old girl who feels like her college career is on the line because she didn't play this one game. There's also attrition. We attribute our failure in the situation while others attribute it to our character. Again, when we see something over and over and over again, these athletes are starting to create patterns of, okay, well, if this happens again, my coach might react in X way because I've seen it 2 times now or 3 times. That a lot of the times we cannot see that attribute to our character because we would never think of it in that way. And then lastly, the impact intent gap. So we judge ourselves by intentions while others judge us by the impact on them. So again, a lot of the times, the more that we can look at it through the athlete's perspective, the far more success that we're going to have. And again, coming back to that start here of the more that we can just reflect on the way that we do things, whether we do them perfectly right now or maybe that we do have some challenges, is a win. Just simply looking at the ways that I do this and understanding that sometimes it's not going to be perfect and it's hard to be perfect. That's never going to happen. But if I can do the most at this the majority of the time, we're going to find success more often. So here are some feedback strategies that we can give to our athletes. With coaches, I think this is one of the most difficult pieces because you're managing about 20 different personalities on one team, and it's hard to kind of custom build a reaction over and over and over again to fit each person. So these are just a couple of the ones that we find most helpful. You definitely don't have to follow this recipe card by the book because there's a lot of different suggestions on here. So the first one on there is determining a time point that works best for the athlete with the athlete. A lot of the times, again, coaches are busy. We have a lot of things on our plate. But by including the athlete in that important moment, even as small as it is as the meeting point of when does this work best for you? Do you want to meet before or after practice? Giving them some choice in the matter of when it's best to receive that feedback. Next, we have asking for feedback from athlete before sharing your feedback. So if you see maybe there's a skill that they need to work on in the drill, maybe starting with asking them, how do you think that went? Or maybe over the past week, hey, I see you've been working on your toe drag. How are you doing with this? Do you feel like you need any help? Where is it coming? Where do you want to be? Again, just checking in with where they're at with that skill or where they feel like they need the feedback first. Then we have checking in about their readiness for feedback. I think this is a really big one of seeing, again, where your kid is at on that day. That some days, this kid just came from school. Maybe they had an exam this day. Maybe they had a tough conversation with a scout or whatever it is that is this moment the exact moment that this kid needs to hear this feedback I'm providing them? If so, how can I deliver it in a different way that might feel better to someone who might not be on their best that day? And if not, how can I postpone this, or is it appropriate to postpone that feedback? Next, we have letting them get prepared for what they need to be successful. So again, providing them with tools to make a correction and making sure they're prepared to hear feedback rather than ripping it out on the bus after a road trip or feeling like they need immediate feedback. This one I find really helpful, the feedback sandwich. So rather than constantly harping on things that they're not good at, can we kind of formulate that with some things that they are doing well? Some people have a really difficult time taking feedback, and that's okay. That's just how different people understand that. So how can we make it a little bit softer by partnering it with something that you can identify from them is important. One of the girls I used to play with, she was one of the people who had a really difficult time with this, but found that when our coach provided her with a little taste of something that she felt she did well, she felt that she wasn't letting down the team in that way, or was able to place some validation on other things of, okay, you know what, I'm still doing well in certain areas. This doesn't feel like a microscope on this one aspect of my game. Following that, we have giving precise information and cues. Again, we were at an organization yesterday, and we were talking about this new coach that they have in place there. And one of the things that we really noticed with him was, for a lot of coaches we saw in that organization, it was very much, you're not doing this right, you need to do that differently, you need to pass it here, what are you doing? Like, a lot of just very vague feedback of identifying that you aren't doing this right, but it's the how can I make the correction. So a lot of the times the kids were getting really scared because they're getting pointed out in class, but they're getting confused, and now they're overwhelmed, and now they're that mistake magnet of making the same mistake over and over and over and over again, and now they're in their head. Where we found that this coach did a super excellent job of identifying that, you know what, you didn't do this right, and that's okay. All you need to do is shift this moment, or focus on that instead, or actually give the instruction of, here's the roadmap into correcting what I feel like wasn't great or what we need to improve. Similarly, underneath that is the explanation on changes to make and why that correction is helpful. So if you're talking about a certain skill, why is it important to have the puck on a certain spot on your blade? If you're talking about positioning, why is it important that our team is doing an umbrella format for our power play versus something else? That can we give an explanation why to help conceptualize why this is important to them as a player and for the team? Asking for clarification. So after giving feedback, can you ask your athlete, does that make sense? Is this something that you understand? Do you have any other questions? That confirming with them and getting that nod or hearing that yes, again, puts this a little bit farther ahead and confirms to you that, okay, this is getting past them. Because I think one of the, sometimes doesn't feel great as a coach is having to repeatedly come back to that same player over and over again of, okay, we're still working on this. Hey, what is, like, why isn't this making sense? Kind of like that drill busting kid that we talked about in the first question there, that does get really frustrating as a coach, and it is hard to navigate sometimes. So again, going that extra mile takes an extra second or two to confirm that this is something that they also understand. Moving forward, finding out what they understand by having them tell you about it. So in this case, kind of following the one underneath there of, could this be something that they could teach another kid at some point, or lead the team on, or go to a level underneath them and teach them how to do it? That can we reinforce that by having them learn it so that they could teach it moving forward? Because again, the more that they know, they conceptualize the skill and actually know the roadmap to it, the more successful they're going to be in completing it over time. So the most important part of this is, can we see this in action? So at your tables, what we would like you to do is practice just with your neighbor or maybe someone across from you on how you can deliver feedback with your athletes, or maybe pose a different situation. One that I really like is the same, like the student or the athlete is trying the same skill and maybe they're not getting it right. How would you deliver that feedback after they haven't done it right for the second time? So I'll flip it back to here so you guys have a little cheat sheet moving forward. And we'll give you guys about 5 minutes to kind of rehearse what this would sound like on your teams with your guys or girls. Okay, so I kind of want to go around, not to every table. I know there's quite a few in here, but asking some feedback from what your table experienced. Was this easy? Was this difficult? How did that go for tables? Absolutely. For those who didn't hear him, he was saying one of the things that they found really helpful is starting these by asking questions with your athletes, and specifically non-closed questions. So asking for more open answers about what they experienced, how they feel, stuff like that. Any other feedback from a brave table? Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that we always like talking about when we're talking about the impact you have on an athlete is the informal connection of being a coach and creating those relationships with your athletes. Yeah, the safest topic you can ever talk about is the sport that you're doing because you already have that shared experience. But when we create relationships, it's going that extra mile. It's like when you're with your work colleagues. Yeah, we can all talk about work. We all know the shop talk. We all know what we're doing. But relationships are really created when we extend past that barrier of what's comfortable in terms of, hey, are you still working on that project? Or, hey, when's your due date? That in terms of work. Sorry if that was misleading. but more so with these athletes is how can we create connection outside of just a practice manual? So how was your day at school? How is math going for you? I know you said that was tough. How's your brother doing? I know he's in hockey. That how can we create these little micro moments of importance in these kids' lives to create that relationship and impactful? I think a lot of the reasons why we think of coaches that are impactful for us are people that were able to connect with us rather than solely teach. That when we talk to students that simply go to school, the teachers that they remember are the ones that cared about them, are the ones that asked them more than just, how's your homework going? Or do you need help with math? You keep using math because I'm not a math brain and why talk for a living instead of hitting the books. But anyway, how can we create those informal connections and creating small spaces to do so? So going on and off a bus, the minutes before practice when people are just shooting around, in between drills when they're standing in line. Again, these small different ways that you can create a really lasting impact on an athlete. Oh, I didn't actually explain what was on the page. What we have here is what we like to call a conversation cheat sheet. So for a lot of us, and myself included, I like seeing the roadmap. I like seeing what would this actually sound like if I were to put this in practice. So when we talk about creating informal connection, here are just a couple different ways on how we can do that on a really small scale. So some of the ones on there are highlighting things that are important to them. So whether that's that class in school, whether it's a project, whether it's maybe a second sport that they play, that is there different ways that we can incorporate things that are important to them in these conversations. Mobilizing supports, talking about people outside of hockey or maybe other people important in their life. And again, just a couple different ways that we can navigate those conversations along the way. To fast forward a little bit, this is one question I really like talking about when I'm working with specifically coaches. Because as we said at the beginning here, no one gets into this to make things bad or to harm people, that we all get into this because there's someone that inspired us or we have a passion for the game specifically. So knowing that most of us here work with another coach, have been coached, or simply aspire to be a certain coach, we'd like for you to discuss at your tables, who is the coach that inspires you to do what you do? Who's the coach that inspires you to stick out a 7-month season, if not longer, through a grueling winter? Who's the person that you think of when you're thinking of the philosophy or the culture that you want to create or the fun you want to emulate? And are these attributes of this coach, did they impact your coaching method at all? So in your groups, if you could share that, and we'll come back shortly. Thank you. Okay, I hope everyone had a chance to kind of discuss who inspires them and who ignites their passion to coach. One of the reasons why we like asking that question is one based off of my own personal experience of coaching. That, as I mentioned, Wisconsin high school girls hockey isn't notable in the talent pool, so we have some tough seasons, and I have that coach in mind as who I want to emulate. This is why I do it. What do I bring to the table? And I think across a whole season, it's hard to feel like we're doing our best all the time because it's just difficult to stay well throughout a really long time. So I find this is a really nice grounding question halfway through your season or 3/4 of your season of saying, okay, what am I trying to emulate, and do I feel like I'm still on the right track? If not, what are places that I can make a little change? And if so, can I just keep doing what I'm doing? And do I feel like I'm well enough to maintain that for the rest of the season? One of the reasons when we talk about coaches' culture, because you are the top of the pyramid. You are the one that influences everyone underneath you, the parents, the refs, the players, and everything in between. And again, staying mentally well throughout a really long season is really challenging. Even the person who teaches this stuff, it's hard for me to stay well for 7 months straight. And it is really challenging to do that. And one of the ways that we really like to think about impacting coaches' culture and your wellness is that self-awareness piece, knowing what is your impact, what are you doing, what do you want to accomplish, and who does this help? So when you think about your coaching style, you can just think of this in your head. What is the biggest strength of your coaching style? What do you do well, and own it? What is that moment that you're like, yes, I know I'm super good at blank? What are some of the challenges in your coaching? Where are the gaps? What are things that you feel like you need to improve on? Where are the holes in your coaching plan? Finally, what type of athlete does this work for? What do your strengths work for? What works for a kid who needs to hear things in black and white versus what does the kid need to hear who maybe might need that feedback sandwich? Who does this fit and why? And then who does this not fit? Where is the gap? Where do I need to pay more attention to those athletes? Who does this serve the least? So again, by asking ourselves these little questions, we might be able to find a lot bigger answers and how we can make a larger impact or work on our own coaching plan. When we get into our next piece here, on our cards, you're gonna see a little mental health continuum on the back. Adrienne is gonna get into that in a second here. One of the big things when we talk about self-awareness, this is arguably the biggest life-changing skill I could ever teach anyone, and I say that to every single client that sits in the chair across from me, is knowing yourself is the biggest power you'll ever have in terms of changing the way you behave and act. So when you think about the next 7 months of your life, I know that sounds like a long time from now, but thinking about who do I want to be at the end of that and what is going to be in between from that? How do I react to stress? How do I react when the call doesn't go my way? How do I react when everything's going great? That the more we know about ourselves, the more power we're going to have in using that information. So I'm going to pass it back to Adrienne to kind of take us home.
All right. As Justine mentioned, on the back of the cards on your table is a mental health continuum. And we started off by talking about the idea that you have to be physically well to lean in and live your best life, and you also have to be mentally well. And there's a lot of conversation lately about it's okay to not be okay. And I've thought a lot about that, and I'm like, not quite right. And we talk about it a lot differently. We don't talk about it's okay to not be okay. The way we talk about it is we talk about jumping into full-colored living. And if you think about when you're born, you're not going to be physically well your entire life. You're going to get injured, you're going to get sick, you'll grab a virus, you might need surgery, but you're just not expected to be physically well your whole life. And we think that if you're living with meaning and purpose and doing things that really matter to you, you're probably not going to be mentally well your whole life as well. You are going to have days that are hard, you're going to have days that are tough, and that's okay. It's not about avoiding that. So with the mental health continuum, a lot of times we're like, wow, what does it mean to be mentally well? And so these are just some of the things, because every human being is different, as Justine was just saying. But we love people to start thinking about this idea of injured, hurt, and healthy. And this is the language we use. If you were to walk into the Bomber Stadium, you'd see a mental health continuum up there. And we use this language because that's the language that they use in the strength room. Coach O'Shea wants to know, is a guy available to me? If they're hurt, they're available, there's something going on. If they're injured, they're not. And it's the same idea with this. And the guys will, we talk about, being a blue head, because that's a bomber in control, or being a red head, which your emotions are driving you. And we talk about that all the time. So it's a nice way to wrap language around it. I've worked with some teams. During COVID, I was consulting with a coach I knew out in the Maritimes, actually, and they took this idea back to their team and had all the athletes write down, like, okay, well, what does it mean for us when we're injured, hurt, healthy? And then they had kind of this team conversation about it. Mental health can be tough to get out there on the table, and having kind of a model or common language helps you to kind of weave it in and talk about it so that you know what you're dealing with. When we think about the 3 levels that we spoke about with respect to culture, as coaches, you deal with yourself as a coach, you deal with your athletes, and you deal with your parents. It's also really important to check in with yourself and see how you're doing. Because if you're in a healthy place, you're going to have conversations probably pretty differently. Hard conversations are really different when we're mentally well and in a good place. On the little cards on your table, we have just in there, we just have some of the strategies for the 3 different levels. We tried to model the fact of imperfection by printing the inside upside down, because we just thought, why not do that? We do apologize for that. But yes, you have those 3 there. We also have that model where challenge and support is what leads to high performance. And then on the back is this idea of the mental health continuum. So hopefully that's something that you can keep with you. And kind of keep some of this content alive. And as we mentioned, you're the biggest culture champion. You're the culture change agent. You're the ones who get to decide kind of what that looks like for those kids. And you're the ones who get to create that environment where those kids can thrive and love what they do every day. So we have a final Menti question here. So if you can grab your phones again. And it's the same number, it looks like, 3339-1166. So if we can switch to the Menti screen. But yeah, what's one small thing you can do to impact culture on your team when you get back? Be curious. I love be curious. There's actually some good, a lot of people are going to be curious, but there's good brain research behind that. It actually activates a different pathway in your head. So that's awesome. Listen, be open, be a leader. Love it. Two-way conversations. Love that. Very cool. As we mentioned, we try to find all sorts of ways to have this conversation. We have a couple podcasts that we do where we have conversation, and our next guest that's dropping in the next couple of days is actually Danny Zilkin. Danny was drafted in the 4th round by the Winnipeg Jets, and look at the expression on his face. You know, that is what it's all about, is really enjoying the moment and just loving every day. And that's why we all love sport. We've had, as we were looking at it, we've had a few hockey guests on there. We mentioned Matt Bailey. We had Jocelyn LaRock, who was just drafted in the First Women's Professional Hockey League. We have Ven Lahovie, who's an incredible story. One of the best female athletes to ever come out of Finland. Used to be a bison athlete as well, did all sorts of fun things. We have Ron McLean on there. So just conversations, and honestly, it's just about learning from people. We don't consider ourselves experts in too much. We love to hear, create space, listen, learn from people, and share those stories with other people. So this podcast is called Heroes in Our Midst, and we have another one called Mental Health for Performance, and Sheldon Kennedy was our first guest, and he's unbelievable in the way he talks about mental health and the process where he had to learn to be well through some really tough stuff. So if any of that's helpful to you, please feel free to check it out. We've really enjoyed the opportunity to talk with you today. And if there's anything we can do to help you, don't hesitate to reach out. Thanks.
Well, thanks very much. Really enjoyed that. Certainly an area of our sport that we all need to be conscious of, and it's an area that we also need to look at changing and provided certainly some guidelines and some steps and some directions of some of the areas that we need to focus on, certainly as an organization and as members of teams. So I really appreciate that. So thank you very much for the opportunity to present today, and it was really worthwhile, certainly for me, and I learned a lot of new things that I wasn't aware of. Before I leave, I have a gift for you.